what does it really mean for a movie to hold up a mirror to society?
Isn't that an extinction level event?
The time for playing is over. It's been over, but it's really over.
Let's not be dramatic here.
Oh gosh.
Do we all know what we've got ourselves into?
Welcome to the Great Reset.
Do we know where we're likely to be going? And who is going to lead us?
You probably have quite a few opinions about what's going on in the news cycle right now. But it's important to remember one thing. You're wrong. Here's why.
It's called brainwashing.
Are we really right that we say we're reducing Russia to a pariah, to a different kind of third world alliance, I wonder? But the essential point that I want to make in all of this is that we, I think, are genuinely at a point of rupture in international relations. In the West, we only confiscate in extreme circumstances like war. I thought we had laws. I thought that we were trying to draw up the contrast between us as law-bearing and Putin's Russia as lawless. But needs must, I suppose. It's enough, isn't it? I mean, it's extraordinary. Trudeau said he put a list of 13 people to have their property confiscated and to be sanctioned, simply because they were on the list drawn up by an opposition spokesman in Russia. Leaving that aside and coming back to the fundamental point. 1945, the idea when it's set up. 4 years after 1945, one of the great seminal works of Western culture is written. That's George Orwell's 1984. George Orwell's 1984. 1945 envisaged this, as I said, internationalism, this rule-based world order, this universality of human rights. It's then, of course, challenged immediately by the horror of the Cold War, as Churchill recognised after the Yalta Conference, that he was actually sacrificing, he and Roosevelt were sacrificing the whole of Eastern Europe to appease Stalin, defeat Hitler that way. And Churchill, of course, with his vast gift for phrases, recognising the fact in the Fulton, Missouri speech that an iron curtain was coming down on Europe. So 1945, those vast hopes aroused, and then those hopes semi-toppled by the Cold War.
Will US and Saudi Arabia finally bury the hatchet? Only time will tell. All of the latest developments signal a thaw in relations. A bid to get the vital strategic alliance back on track. Biden and the Crown Prince may not like each other, but they have realized they need each other.
And peace, of course, across the Iron Curtain, preserved only by the mutually assured destruction of nuclear weapons. Another vision, however, 1945, another vision, few years later, was formulated that took account of the Cold War, that took account of nuclear weapons, that took account of the radical differences between the world on either side of the Iron Curtain, and that is, of course, George Orwell's masterpiece, 1984, published, as I said, in 1989. We all know the sort of story there. Of its hero, anti-hero, finally leading resistance against a totalitarian regime, and finally, after threats of unspeakable torture, realising, well, he actually loved Big Brother, the wonderful words that are given to us of Newspeak and all the rest of it, the idea of a language that is so perverted and so adapted that you can't think anything but what people want you to think.
Fast forward to today. There are only 7 nations on Earth that are considered to be absolute monarchies, places where there is no democracy, there is no voting, and the entire country is controlled by a royal family. Saudi Arabia is one of those countries. The House of Saud, otherwise known as the Saudis royal family, entirely controls the country of Saudi Arabia. And not only that, they're estimated to be the richest family in the entire world, with the net worth being over $1.4 trillion. That's around 16 times more than the net worth of the British royal family. And when it comes to controlling that wealth, it really comes down to just one man. Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud, otherwise known as MBS, is the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. Although he's not yet king, he's basically ruling the entire country in place of his father, King Salman. MBS holds complete power over almost everything in Saudi Arabia, and he doesn't really have to ask anyone's permission to make decisions for the country's future. But what's most important for the sake of this story is that he controls the nation's money, both the Saudi's National Wealth Fund as well as Aramco, the producer of the nation's oil. Basically, if MBS wants to make a decision to change how Saudi Arabia does business with the rest of the world, he can do that, and it seems he is about to do that with oil. And if he does, it's not just going to change Saudi Arabia's relationship with the world, it's going to do a lot more than that, and it could result in the complete collapse of the US dollar.
If you're positing an actual reversal of globalization, that could have implications, as you suggest. But I wonder if that's really going to happen because of policies that we adopt. You know, the technology goes instantly around the world. It's not going to be easy to stop that. The economy's become very globalized. And also, you know, production technology is so much more efficient than it was. You can do things, you know, with the new technologies. You can manufacture things here. It may or may not result in a lot of jobs in manufacturing, but you can certainly make things. There may be reshoring here that's actually quite efficient. Cost.
So the jobs will come back to the U.S., but they'll be taken by robots, sort of is here. Which
there is some of that.
There's some of that. Yeah.
The idea also that the past has to be obliterated, or at least perpetually made to fit with the present. A bit like work, really. Anyway, all of that. But that's what we remember about it. I want to put something else in place. What we've forgotten is the way in which Orwell set it. He set that novel not simply as a drama of the individual against totalitarianism and the destruction of thought, of culture, of life itself by totalitarianism. He set it within a radically different context of international relations. He saw that behind the charade of the United Nations there could be another reality emerging, and he actually prophesied in the novel another reality emerging, instead of the idea that we'd all sit down in New York and negotiate away war through the General Assembly and the Security Council of the General Secretary and the whole of these panoplies of immensely well-paid figures who, you know, parade in suits in New York. Instead of that, he envisaged a world that was divided essentially into three mutually warring powers.
You might not even know it, but there's really only one thing that gives the US dollar power on the world stage today. Some call it black gold, or even dinosaur juice, but to most of us it's simply known as oil. Oil is what makes the world go round, and it's considered to be the most valuable commodity on Earth. But there's a massive change on the horizon for oil, something that involves three of the world's most powerful leaders. And it's an event that may result in the collapse and death of the US dollar.
Seems simple, but this was a top secret visit. Details of the visit are not available, but some reports suggest they discussed everything from the Russian invasion to the oil production. Even the war in Yemen is said to have been featured in the talks. So why was the US spy master suddenly in Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia has been a US ally for over 70 years.
China, now probably the world's biggest power, certainly soon will be. China was not mentioned. And this raises an absolutely fundamental question. Pariah to whom?
China is currently the second largest consumer of oil on the planet, but like everybody else, they still have to buy their oil in the US dollar. For China, this isn't ideal. Because the United States is their biggest competitor on the world stage, being forced to buy oil in dollars means they're giving power to their main rival.
And there's a state of permanent war between them, and there's a state of missiles flying around and all the rest of it, and there's a state of profound conflict between them. He envisaged three of them. He thought England was on the front line, He envisaged one power core, the novel basically set in London. Are the democracies the world? It's a very uncomfortable fact, which again, no journalist bothered to raise, was so ill-mannered to raise. Democracies comprise 20% of world states. 20% of the world is democratic. 1/5, no more. We are not the world. We're a minority. We're fundamentally the Anglosphere. That's the former British Commonwealth plus America and Europe. That's it, pretty well. The little dots elsewhere, but that's what we call the world. Isn't this astonishingly short-sighted?
But that might not last for that much longer, because only a few days ago it was announced that Saudi Arabia is considering not forcing China to buy oil in the US dollars. Instead, they may soon be able to buy it in their own currency.
What kind of threat does this pose to the traditional banking system?
Well, I think it's, you have incumbents, the banks, commercial banks, and you have the disruptors. And clearly the disruptors are having an impact on the incumbents. We just heard a very large systemic bank here saying that they're launching their digital coin, currently piloted in a way within the institutional clients, but to be scaled beyond that. We heard from the European Central Bank that they have launched in November something that is called TIPS, that enables all the banks in the Eurozone to actually transfer instantly at virtually no cost money between them.
Anyway, he envisages 3 rival powers. England and America form Oceania, and presumably the rest of the British Empire. The great frontier is then the Channel, which means London is very near that frontier, and on the other side is Eurasia. And Eurasia is in fact a Russia that has broken the Iron Curtain and has flooded over Europe and is stopped only at the Channel. And then beyond Russia, further to the east, is East Asia, which is presumably, he's vague on this, which is China and Japan and the rest. He envisages then a world not of globalization, but a world of fragmentation, a world of 3 rival power blocks.
I can't overstate how huge this would be if this happens. If Saudi Arabia allows China to buy oil in the yuan, it would seriously devalue the US dollar and diminish its power on the world stage.
The two countries have had a security for oil relationship. It began 8 decades ago with Franklin D. Roosevelt and King Ibn Saud. This relationship lasted through 14 US presidencies until Biden.
So I think the role of the disruptors and anything that is using distributed ledger technology, whether you call it crypto assets, currencies or whatever, and it's far from the bitcoins that we used to talk about a year ago, that is clearly shaking the system.
Under the Biden presidency, everything changed. He did not call Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He released declassified intelligence reports on Khashoggi's killing and documents looking into Saudi's connection to the 9/11 attacks.
And you know what? I think the likely outcome, let's supposing that the world isn't blown up, let's supposing that, loose talk of no-fly zones actually pumping very large numbers of arms into one combatant power, the attempt at ruining the economy could easily also be construed as an act of war.
Yeah, exactly, because you would give something of a tax break, right, to appreciation of crypto?
Yeah, just the same as you do for regular currency. So, I'm not for, redefining the whole regulatory framework, at least initially. It's just, let's apply what already applies to other currencies.
So let me ask, if it's not a security, does CFTC regulate it? And regulation seems to be important. I mean, actually, Bitcoin is down substantially today because China has reiterated its position. It doesn't want its people trading in crypto.
Well, it doesn't want people trading in something else that China doesn't control. So China's an authoritarian regime, and they're in the process of launching a central bank digital currency. So it'll behave a lot like, Bitcoin would, except that it's completely opposite. It'll have the central authority, the Chinese Communist Party, controlling all of the behavior of it. So they'll be able to literally monitor every individual's transactions, and they'll be able to link it to their other data to essentially establish a social credit score, not just an ability to repay, but are you being a good citizen in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party? So it's really a system of control, not a real monetary system in the sense of store of value, means of exchange.
Congressman, cryptocurrency is figured largely in the ransomware demands on some of the attacks on infrastructure. It's not clear to me how a ransomware would work if there didn't have the pseudonymity of cryptocurrency. Is there any way to make sure we still have cryptocurrency, but it isn't used for really illegal purposes? Certainly ransomware, but others as well.
Yeah, and I think this is why it's important that U.S. Treasury gets after things like, there's a company, Chainalysis, is one of the early movers in this space. But if you truly wanted to be, private, you wouldn't put it on the chain. You wouldn't put it on a public ledger.
Congressman, if in fact there's regulation that goes forward, does the CFTC do it?
Well, the CFTC is the primary regulator for Bitcoin and Ethereum. There hasn't been a clear ruling on other crypto products. And look, everyone thinks about the payment systems, but the broader architecture, blockchain, is going to be dynamic just like the internet. I mean, we're 30 years into the internet, and we haven't even begun to tap all the use cases. So we're in the infancy of the blockchain architecture, and it truly is a different architecture, a different way to establish trust in a much more secure way.
And also, it would put so much more faith and power in the Chinese currency as well. In fact, it's already doing that, because even the recent news of these talks taking place has caused the yuan to increase in value. History also shows that most of the world's oil producers follow in Saudi Arabia's footsteps. So if they allow for a different currency, the rest would probably too. And this could start a domino effect, essentially taking away the last thing that is giving the US global value. In short, this is probably the beginning of the end of the US dollar. Just last week, I published a video about how the financial empire of the United States is already in decline. Now, if you haven't seen that video, there is a link down below. I didn't think that things could get worse for the United States dollar. However, it seems I was wrong. Because if the world does disconnect the US dollar from oil, it means that the US dollar will be severely devalued. And so if your assets or cash are in USD, or if your business is all done in USD, it could mean up ahead some bad times.
The US-Saudi relationship has been on the rocks. The traditionally strong alliance had hit a rough patch. US has since been trying to improve relations, but the initial response from the Saudis has been cool.
In 1973, the Yom Kippur War was fought between Israel and a group of Arab nations. Israel won the war, but afterwards the nations on the other side wanted to punish the countries that supported Israel. At the time, Saudi Arabia was the leader of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they decided to put an embargo on nations that supported Israel in the war and to stop selling them oil. Countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the United States. Because of how much oil was exported from the Middle East, this caused global oil prices to skyrocket. The cost of oil went up by 300% and caused the start of a massive global oil crisis. So hopefully this illustrates the point of how much power oil-producing countries have over the rest of the world and how quickly the state of the world can change with just one single decision. Now, after the oil crisis started in the 1970s, the United States decided it needed to do something to stabilize the price of oil, and so it started its discussions with Saudi Arabia to end the crisis. In 1974, the United States struck a deal with the Saudis. The deal included a guarantee that the US would provide security to the nation and sell them even more weapons. But the US got something even more valuable in return. To encourage stability in oil prices, Saudi Arabia agreed to conduct all their oil trade in the US dollar. And very soon, almost every other oil exporting country on the planet started doing the same. Today, more than 80% of all oil traded on the planet is done in the US dollar, and this is because of the deal that was struck between Saudi Arabia and America in the 1970s. This has resulted in the oil economy being quite stable over the last 50 years, and it's also given the US immense financial power because of the billions of dollars that have to be traded in that currency.
Let us hope we don't actually finish up in a war with Putin's Russia. Let's hope we do survive. What will the world on the other side look like?
It looks like Burns and MBS had what is being called a good conversation. better than what most US official engagements have been. Not just that, US has also ended a 15-month-long diplomatic snub. Biden has named a US ambassador to Riyadh. He chose Michael Ratney for the position. Ratney is the career diplomat with a lot of experience in the region. So why is Washington suddenly pivoting hard? The Russian invasion has thrown up new geopolitical realities. US needs Saudi Arabia for oil again. Riyadh needs Washington for defense and security again. Another reason is Saudi's deepening ties with both Russia and China. Riyadh has signaled it wants closer ties with Beijing. The kingdom even invited the Chinese president to visit this year. Reports suggest the two nations are even in talks to price some crude it sells to China in yuan. If Saudi Arabia does that, it will change the dynamics of the forex market. The move might even prompt other buyers to follow.
If the US dollar does collapse as a result of the new moves in oil, what are some things that you could do? This is not financial advice, this is just some food for thought. But personally for myself, I believe having all your eggs in one basket is a pretty dangerous idea. So over the years, I've tried to diversify my cash and putting it in multiple currencies in multiple places around the world. Because if there is a collapse of a currency, I'll still be okay because my other assets hopefully are still holding value. So if I did have all my money in the US dollar right now, I would be considering changing that a little bit, and I would be looking at diversifying into different currencies, potentially the euro, the pound, maybe even the Chinese yuan. I also diversify into different forms of cash, so cryptocurrency, for example, or precious metals such as gold and silver, which have been money for thousands of years. Sure, you and we've spent most of our lives in a time where the US dollar was the almighty and it was the most trusted currency on the planet, but things always shift and change, and it seems that that is on the horizon for us as well.
But what's going to happen? Well, as I said, the extraordinary silence about China in that press conference, indeed, generally speaking, the extraordinary silence from China herself. There have been mildly apologetic noises at the United Nations, no veto of the resolutions against Russia, but equally a very, very careful stance of abstention, of neutrality, and at the same time, of course, Xi and Putin met shortly before the invasion. At the same time, much talk about relations between China and Russia being as close as ever. Let's look at what is likely to happen. We cut the financial ties, the banking system ties between Russia and the West. We cut the system of credit cards. We cut social media. We cut air transport. We presumably at some point either the Russians turn off the gas, or if we get our act together, we turn off their gas. So we've created a much more powerful version of the Iron Curtain. We've moved Russia back to that different frontier, right? What is there to the east? Well, China needs everything that Russia produces. China has an insatiable demand for power. It burns coal. Why not? It can even proclaim that it's doing something towards solving global warming. Burn Russian gas instead. As it were, turn the pipeline round so that it feeds China, pushes its power into China to feed Chinese industry. What else? Well, China has already been developing a separate system of international money transfer to rival SWIFT. Isn't it rather likely that Russia, with more and more of its trade going to China, will also join that Chinese-based system of international money transfer? China, of course, is desperately keen to develop its own highly sophisticated instruments of credit and so on. Presumably, I don't know, somebody really should have investigated, shouldn't there? Presumably there are Chinese credit cards. If Russia is deprived of Western credit cards next door, vast country of China, well, it will have separate credit cards, which will become Russo-Chinese credit cards. How soon before Aeroflot starts flying over China and branching out from China? Well, actually, India has been also very carefully neutral and ambiguous. It too abstained in the United Nations. Pakistan has been positively friendly to Russia. You can just see how it will broaden. So what I think is likely to happen, and by the way, of course, IKEA, there'll be queues of Chinese companies desperate to take over those IKEAs, and I imagine producing virtually the identical product. You know, if you don't have Amazon in Russia, well, Alibaba is just waiting there to take up the slack. So what I think is going to happen is that indeed Russia will be separate from the West, but what we will have done, we will have simply created the world that 1984 imagines, but with a different frontier. The states will look a bit different. We will have Anglo-Europa. That is America, Europe, and the old white, I won't use the word, white Commonwealth, what is conventionally referred to as the Anglosphere. That's a kind of expanded version of Orwell's Oceania. It will have taken in Europe, though it will be Anglo-Europa. Then you will have what I suppose we'd better call Russo-China. And then, well, I think they'll be the two bitterly opposed blocs in a state of semi-permanent war, I would guess. Because, of course, do we really think China is going to hold back from acquiring Taiwan? And then I think there will be, oh, and by the way, I should have added, I think significant parts, Oceania will actually go round, won't it? It will include Japan. It will include South Korea, and there will be another profoundly disputed frontier in the China Sea. I mean, those suddenly places like Malaysia and whatever, and Vietnam or whatever, will find themselves absolutely in the front line of what may be an increasingly hot war.
The entire world is losing its mind, but nevertheless, it does feel like something is ending, like we're awakening from a dream. And in that sense, about our future as it is about our past, about the closing of a chapter, one where, for a while,
we really did have everything, didn't we?
To start, you're completely missing the point, and everything you think is actually at odds with reality when you look at the data.
And boy has it ruffled some feathers to dive into a complex societal issue.